This video lecture is on analyzing your audience. One of the first things we need to do before we ever give a speech is decide who our audience is going to be. Everything we do is audience-centered. We tailor every aspect of our speech toward the audience. Now, one thing about this course is that normally I teach this face-to-face. So when we talk about our audience, we're talking about our classroom audience. In fact, every speech that you give in a face-to-face classroom is given to the same audience, and they're all members of our Com Studies 220 course. Instead, however, you're going to be delivering your speeches in front of a camera, typically either to some family members or in many cases by yourself. However, what I'd like you to do is, as you're approaching the speech-making process, assume that you're giving your speech to your Com Studies 220 classroom. And that's the perspective that we're going to be taking. So the first thing we do in audience analysis is determine your audience. And your audience would be your classmates in your public speaking class. And we then want to decide who our audience is. So we engage in what we call audience analysis. Audience analysis helps us to determine the aspect of our audience so that we can tailor our message, our examples, our research, everything to that specific audience. And we do this by looking at two broad areas of information. The first is we look at demographic characteristics. Demographic characteristics are the concrete aspects of your audience that typically you can determine by looking at them or making some educated guesses. Psychographic characteristics, then, are the abstract characteristics about your audience. These are the things that your audience holds within them. It's their psychology, it's their values, it's their morals, it's all of those things. And you typically have to make some educated guesses about those, oftentimes based on the demographic characteristics. So the first thing we want to understand is that there are as many as 7 different demographic characteristics that you may want to learn about your audience. And we're going to look at each one of these individually. Most of these may not apply to your particular speech or your topic, but many of these will. So it's important to look at each one of these, especially since your chapters are covering this, your Revel quizzes, and the exam that I'm going to be giving in class will be focused a lot on these demographic characteristics. So let's begin with age. The first thing we want to understand is that we never look at the median age of our audience. Typically, the age range of your audience could vary. In your classroom speeches, for example, you're going to have students as young as 15 or 16 who are running start students, all the way up to members of your audience who are in their 50s or 60s. So if you just look at the average age, you're going to miss those members of your audience who are at the younger end and those who are at the older end. So we want to look at the range of our audience. And if you start your speech process by determining your range, then you now know, look, I've got to find a speech topic and use examples, etc., that are going to appeal to the 15-year-old all the way up to the 60-year-old. So always determine your age range. The second thing then is, once you've determined that range, is how does that impact your topic? Are there topics that are going to appeal to a younger audience more so than an older audience, and vice versa? So we want to ask ourselves, if I pick this topic, will it resonate with younger people and older people? For example, if I want to give a speech on how to select the proper snowboard, how snowboards are made, what are the materials that go into them, how are they taken care of, that may appeal to the person in their teens, 20s, and 30s. It may not appeal to the person who's in their 50s or 60s, and as a result, they have no reason to continue listening to your speech. Now, can you make a speech on snowboarding relevant to someone in their 50s or 60s? Absolutely. If we have people in our lives for which we may buy a snowboard for them, the Olympics, snowboarding is an Olympic event, so learning more about snowboarding can help me to appreciate the Olympics. Or let's say I want to do a speech topic on how to prepare for your retirement. You may have students in their teens who think, well, gosh, I'm not working yet. I still live at home with mom and dad. I don't have my first job, so why should I care about preparing for my retirement? Can you make a speech on preparing for your retirement relevant to someone in their teens? Absolutely. You can talk about how valuable it is to start preparing for your retirement very early. Even putting away a few dollars in your teens could be the difference between retiring with $100,000 in an IRA and a couple of $1,000,000 in an IRA. So your job is to figure out a way to take whatever topic you choose and make it resonate both with the younger students and the older students in your audience. It will also impact your language choice. If you assume everyone in your audience is in their teens and you're in your teens, then you may end up using language and terminology that only appeals and can be only understood by that age group. For example, there's a lot of slang terminology that gets used all the time that someone in their 50s or 60s may not understand. Same is true with your older people. If you're an older student giving a speech to a younger crowd and you're using terminology that was popular 20 years ago, you may lose them as well. This also extends to examples. A lot of times we want to pepper our speeches with examples to help illustrate some of our concepts. Be careful if you're using music as an example. Is this the type of music everybody's going to relate to? How about historical examples? If you start talking about things that were happening in the 70s and 80s because you happen to be 50 or 60 years old, the younger people in your audience are not going to have any idea about that any more than if you're a younger person using an example of a recent movie, a superhero movie, or a television show that's geared toward young adults. People who are older in your audience may not resonate with that. So age is important to consider. The next demographic characteristic is sex and sexual orientation. This will impact your topic. There are a lot of topics, for example, that are inherently more relevant to one sex than the other. If I were to talk about breast cancer, and I talk only about breast cancer as if it only applies to women in this audience, then I'm leaving out the men. Can I make a speech on breast cancer relevant to men? Absolutely. I just need to help my audience understand that one, men get breast cancer, so this is not something that's only happens to women. And even men who don't get breast cancer are affected by it when women in their lives get cancer. So we always want to make sure that the topics we choose are relevant to the sexes in the audience. This also means be careful of lapsing into maybe sexist behavior, assuming that if you're going to talk about sports, you have to sort of mansplain that to the women in the audience, or if you're going to talk about cooking, you have to somehow talk to men as if they know nothing about cooking. So avoid the sort of sex stereotypes when you're speaking. Be careful, too, of language choice. Make sure we're using inclusive language. It's tempting to assume that all men are looking for a woman, all women are looking for a man as their romantic partner, not taking into consideration the LGBT community. So rather than suggest that all men are looking for their wife or all women are looking for their husband, use terms like your partner, your significant other, so that we're as inclusive as possible with our audience. We also want to be careful of avoiding sexist terminology. I have students all the time who will say, write your congressman. Well, in the state of Washington, the majority of people who represent us in Congress are women. For a long time, our governor was a woman. So the idea here of avoiding that sexist terminology is, for example, it's easy to forget. So I have students all the time who will say, if you're going to go talk to a doctor, make sure he tells you all of the pros and cons of getting this procedure done. Or when you walk into the doctor's office, check with the nurse. She'll be able to give you some, overview as to what to expect. What we want is to use what we call non-gender specific terminology. So use terms like they and their or his and her to avoid that sort of sexist terminology. Race and ethnicity is important. It's important to pick topics that are going to resonate with all ethnicities, all races. It affects examples. If you've got students in an audience who are not from the United States, who didn't grow up here, then they may not be familiar with some of the more culturally American terms. I'll give you a great example. Only in the United States is the term football representing the NFL. You say the word football anywhere else in the entire world and it means soccer. Yet, as Americans, we assume that when we use the term football that everybody understands we're talking about American football. So we want to be careful about ethnocentrism, paying attention to the fact that we approach topics from a decidedly American or from your own ethnicity, forgetting that other people may not share in that same ethnicity. Being careful of not to offend by telling an off-color joke, something that might not be as relevant or acceptable to a mixed group of people. Same with language choice. Make sure if you're choosing language that's decidedly American or uses terminology that's part of our own culture, and you have people in your audience who are from a different ethnicity or race, be sensitive to that. Education. It's tempting to assume that everybody with a formal education has the same degree of knowledge. For example, you can assume most of the people in your audience have graduated from high school and the rest are about to graduate from high school if they're running START. So it's tempting to assume that everybody has the same level of education. But if I were giving a speech on the human circulatory system, could I assume everybody remembers how many ventricles there are in the heart, the difference between an artery and a capillary? So one of the things we want to understand is that even though your audience has a high school education, there may be levels of education that they have not achieved. So if I was an economics major, I probably have very specific knowledge over somebody who was a biology major. The one thing that comes up all the time, however, is the informal level of education. This is what I like to call sort of your street smarts, things that you've learned just by sort of growing up and participating in society. And the things that come up more often than not are abbreviations and acronyms. People will throw out abbreviations and acronyms all the time, assuming everybody just understands them. I think you can probably assume everybody knows what the IRS is, or the CIA, or the FBI. But if I were to mention statistics from FEMA, your audience may not understand that FEMA stands for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or PETA, which is the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. So if you're going to use abbreviations or acronyms, explain them to your audience. Make the assumption that they're not going to know what those abbreviations are and spell them out. Same with jargon. Jargon is terminology that's used within specific venues, jobs, any of those kinds of things. If you're an economics major, you use jargon all the time. I used to work in restaurants when I was in college. We used jargon all the time that no one would understand who didn't work in a restaurant. We have jargon in this classroom. We've talked about our clinchers. We've talked about our attention getters. So make sure that if you are engaging in jargon with your speeches that you're explaining it, that you're not, assuming everybody understands. Sports is a great example. People who play a certain sport, people who are in the military, for example, use jargon all the time that no one outside the military or outside that sport would understand. Religion. Religion gets its own category, and the reason it does is because I think the best way to view the way religion affects your speeches is that your religion shapes your worldview. How you view the world is shaped by your religion, and we tend to assume that everybody shares the same religion that we do. For example, let's say I opened my speech with this story. I said, look, I know you all remember what it was like to wake up on Christmas morning and come downstairs and see all the presents under the tree. Well, listening to my speech is going to be like opening a present on Christmas Day. The challenge here is not everybody is Christian. Not everybody celebrates Christmas, so you're not being inclusive. A better way to approach it is to say, imagine a celebration you might have where you were receiving a gift or giving a gift and how excited that you were about that. The assumption that everybody shares these same religious views can be the first place your audience is going to want to tune out. The other thing, too, is inclusivity. understanding that not everybody believes the same way you do and doesn't view the world this way. For example, the religion somebody ascribes to is going to shape how they believe about abortion rights, gay rights, gun control, immigration, all of those things. So don't assume everybody shares that. It's also important to separate your worldview based on your religion from the way you're going to approach an audience. And I'll give you a great example that illustrates this. I had a young woman a few quarters ago who was homeschooled. She was about 16 years old. She'd never been to a public school before, so her first time at a public institution was at Clark. In the middle of her speech, she made this comment. She said, "Whether you are single, married, or living in sin." Now, the audience heard that and immediately sort of recoiled. And then in our oral critiques for speeches, we talked a little bit about that. And to her credit, she'd grown up in a very religious household where she'd been taught living together without being married in a romantic relationship is living in sin. What she didn't do is separate herself from those religious views and make the decision to say maybe not everybody will hear that the same way. So we want to respect differences. We want to be inclusive. Economic status. It's tempting to assume that everybody shares your own same economic status. Let's say you grew up in a very affluent neighborhood, and you all the time complain about how hard it was to hire good household help because the butler fought with the maid, and you use this as your example to open with. I guarantee you not everybody in your audience is going to be able to identify with that. Conversely, if you decide everybody is poor because they're at a community college, that can be offensive. I've had students actually make that comment, and it's offensive to me and it's offensive to other students to suggest that the only reason you're at Clark College is because you can't afford to go to, a quote-unquote real college. So be careful that you're not making assumptions about economic status. I think one of the things you can do with your examples is to assume that everyone in your audience is there because they do want to better themselves economically. They want to get good jobs. They want to provide for their families. So make sure the examples you use reflect an economic status of your audience that you can actually embrace and utilize, as opposed to risking offending anybody because you're talking about economics in a very judgmental or a way that assumes everybody shares the same economic status. Group memberships. Much like religion, our groups shape how we view the world. So if you're a Democrat, you see the President Trump administration differently than a Democrat. If you are an environmentalist, you see recycling issues differently than somebody who's not an environmentalist. Social groups shape our worldview. If I belong to a union in my job, I see teacher strikes differently. So it's important that you kind of think about what group memberships in your audience could impact the way they hear your speech. If you're going to come up with a certain example, ask yourself, boy, is there a group that I'm assuming everybody belongs to that will hear that they need to be in that group in order to understand this example. So those are the 7 different demographic characteristics, and I think it's important that as you're writing your speeches, consider each of those 7 demographics. In many cases, those demographics won't matter, but I think it's important that you kind of snap that lens on and say, if I make this assumption, if I use this example, who might be left out of this message? It's also important that you analyze your audience psychographics. Psychographics are the psychological aspects of your audience that will shape how they react to your message, whether they're engaged, whether they're motivated. And the way we look at psychographic information is kind of to understand that they fall kind of on a hierarchy. Our values are those things we hold to be good or bad. We measure everything using our value systems. Our values then shape our beliefs. Our beliefs then shape our attitudes, and our attitudes then shape our behaviors. So if, for example, you have a topic that challenges a core value, your audience immediately will probably cease to listen because that value system is core to everything. And because it's core to everything, it's going to shape beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, which means if you've already irritated me because you've challenged a core value, then I'm going to stop listening. A good example of this, let's say I want to give a speech telling you how to fill out your income taxes. But I tell you that in the course of doing that, I'm going to give you some tips on how to make an extra $1,000 on your tax return. Even though it's a little shady, you can still make all this extra money. I think an audience hearing this might say, well, wait a minute, that contradicts my value of honesty. So I don't even want to continue listening because you've already challenged a core value. However, I can embrace a value. I could say, look, today I want to convince you that we need to fix our education system. And it's going to cost us some money. You're going to have to pay some extra taxes. So right away, my back might go up by saying, well, wait a minute, I don't want to do anything that's going to cost me more money. But if I say to you, I get it, we don't want to pay more money for things, but remember, you value your family. You value quality of life. The only way we can do that is to fix our educational system. If we don't have a good educational system, your kids are not going to have a quality of life. So yeah, it's going to cost a little money, but that's consistent with your values. Same with beliefs. It's hard to challenge a belief system, but you can do it if you make sure that you're not contradicting a belief. Same with attitudes. Attitudes are fairly superficial. They're the things we decide what we believe kind of on the fly. So I hear about a new topic and I think, gosh, that's interesting. I think I kind of like that, but I haven't really decided yet. That will depend on your beliefs and your value systems. And then, of course, behaviors are dependent on everything else. So if you're trying to get somebody to change a behavior, but you have contradicted a core value or a core belief, you're never going to get there. You're never going to get them to change a behavior. So it's important that you're looking at each of these levels of influence. So that's audience analysis. The other thing that we want to understand is that we are gathering information about our audience so we can make that audience analysis. So we observe our audience. If you understand, hey, I'm going to be giving a speech to my classroom audience, then do some observation beforehand. Who are they? What are they wearing? How do they behave? What are some of their conversations? You could consider doing a survey of your audience. You could interview some members of your audience to get a sense of where they are, or do some research. There's a lot of demographic information out there on audiences. If you're speaking to an audience that's outside the classroom, you've been asked to speak at a PTA meeting, speak at a local Young Democrats Society or Young Republicans Club, the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, a religious group, research them, figure out who they are, go to their website and see what they're all about, get some of their mission statements. There are all kinds of ways that you can gather information about an audience. Analyze your specific speaking situations. Is this an audience that has to be there? For example, your classroom audience has to be there. So many of them may not be supportive of your topic, may not be interested in your topic. How do you get them interested? In other cases, you're going to speak to an audience who does want to be there, who are there to hear your opinions. What's the size of your audience? How loud am I going to have to speak? Do I have to kind of move around to make sure I'm getting everybody in the audience? What's the occasion? Are they expecting that this audience, or that this topic is going to be funny? Is it going to be serious? Is it a celebratory occasion? Am I giving a speech of tribute? What's the physical environment? Will everybody be sitting on benches? Will they be sitting in chairs? Do I have to have a microphone? Do I have to kind of walk around the audience and talk to them? Get a sense of what your physical environment's going to be. And finally, time. How long do I have to speak? I have time limits for my speeches because there will never be a time where someone will ask you to come give a speech to an audience. You can speak about whatever you want for as long as you want. More often than not, they're going to say, come and give a 10-minute presentation on this particular topic. That means your speech should be 10 minutes. It shouldn't be 20 minutes. It shouldn't be 30 minutes. You should recognize those time constraints. So time is important. You also want to analyze your audience during and after your speech, not just before the speech. while you're giving the speech, monitor their attention. Are they falling asleep? Are they yawning? Are they straining to hear you? Are they talking to other people next to them and looking like, what did he just say? What did she just say? And then change your style accordingly. Repeat things, rephrase them, define statements. This is why we always write our speeches out ahead of time, so you can challenge yourself to read through your speech and make changes as necessary. Spell out that jargon or those abbreviations and acronyms, define that jargon, any of those things. You also want to analyze your audience to see if they agree or disagree with you. Maybe they're nodding their head while you're saying something, or maybe they're frowning and shaking their head. How do you adapt to that? Do you adjust your speech accordingly? After the speech, take some questions. Accept your critiques graciously. If someone, like for example in my classroom speeches, I open the floor for critiques and I say, hey everybody, let's give them some feedback. What are some things we liked? What are some things we'd like you to work on? Make sure you're accepting those critiques graciously. So that's audience analysis. Again, most of this is in the textbook. This will also be in your Revel quizzes. But as you're writing and delivering your speeches, I'm hoping that you've paid attention to audience analysis. As I'm grading your speeches, I'm going to be saying to, grading, looking at this, saying, have they considered writing this for an audience of classroom participants? In other words, does this speech sound like it was written for a Com Studies 220 face-to-face audience? Again, got any questions, make sure you email me, and I'll see you in the next video.